In this section, we're going to talk about the beginnings of generating HTML forms. Now, forms are really important because forms are where the user can provide data to your application or website. Now, most designers kind of ignore forms, but studies have shown the quality of your forms are an important part of the factors as to whether or not a user converts when they visit your web page. When I say converts, what I mean is, does the user do what you want them to when they visit your page, whether that be is buying a product or signing up for a mailing list or what have you. So we're going to talk about forms here, and when we start building a form, we start with the form tag. Now, the form tag has a couple of attributes you're going to want to use every time. The first one is action, and that's where does the form go to be processed. This is usually going to be some type of URL, like, for example, formprocess.php or something like that. Now, in order to process forms, you really need PHP or some other back-end language. So we don't cover form processing in this course, but if you work with a developer or programmer, they can help you with form processing. So they could tell you exactly what to put in the action. I'm just putting a pound sign because we don't really have a link there. The other attribute that you must put is method. Now, method has one of two values, and you can see the possibilities are get or post. Now, get is less common. What happens when you use get is the information the user has typed into the form is appended to the URL as what's called a query string and passed to the page indicated in the action attribute. If you use post, basically all of that information the user puts in the form is placed into an array and passed to the processing page. Post is considered more secure because get actually exposes what the user typed into the form. So if the user typed in a password or a credit card number or a social security number, that would appear right in the URL. And obviously that can make users uncomfortable if they see their personal information in the URL. So we try and avoid using get. Now, of course, we close the form at the end of it, and what we have inside the form element are going to be the elements that collect the data and the labels for those elements. So usually to make my forms neat, I like to put my forms inside a table. Now, I know this is cheating a little bit because this is not exactly tabular information. We're kind of using the table for layout, but it does produce fairly good-looking forms in a way that's really not practical with CSS alone. So I do recommend that you use tables to keep your forms organized. So our table is not going to have any borders, and I'm going to go ahead and just do that. And each row is going to contain a field for the label and a field for the actual element that the user will use to type in their information. So let's say we're going to collect a first name and a last name. So we have first name here in the first table data cell in this row. In the second table data cell in this row, see I made a mistake there, we're going to have the actual input tag. Now this is the unit that the user is going to use to input their information or type in their information. It's going to look like a text field. So input type equals text, and then we've got to give it a name. Now the name is how it will be referred to when it's passed to the server in the URL here in this action. So what the server will see is, in this case, first equals whatever the user typed in. So we use the name attribute to differentiate our input fields. Now, if you're going to be working with these fields in JavaScript, you will likely also need an ID attribute. The ID value can be the same as the name because they're used for two separate purposes. If you take my JavaScript course later, you're going to see exactly how to use those. But most of the time, if you're working with a separate developer, they're going to want you to have both a name and an ID. The name being the value or the label for the value that's passed to the server. The ID being how this particular element is grabbed using JavaScript. All right, so that's that row. So now let's add an additional row. So I'm going to come right here under this row, open the table row tag, and again, close at the same time because otherwise I forget. And now, so here's a second table data. We'll ask for last name. TD, there we go. So again, here's our input tag. Input type equals text, name equals last. So this one would go to the server as last equals whatever the user put. So again, we're differentiating them by giving them different names and different IDs. Don't forget that the name is for the server and the ID is for JavaScript if you use any. Let's do one last one here. Let's do password. So I'm going to go ahead and put password as the label. And again, I'm just using the table to line these up nicely as we go. And then the final input type equals. Now, for this one, I could put text, but I'm going to put password. And I'm going to show you what happens. It's a separate type of input. Password ID equals password. I'm sure you've seen password input types used before. You just didn't realize how they were different. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and save. And let's just view this in the internal browser here in Komodo. Make it nice and easy. All right, so nice and lined up because of the table. So I type my first name, type my last name, and then the password. So I type my password, and what happens is because I use the type equals password here, indicating that this particular input is of the type password, it echoes dots, or in some browsers, I believe, asterisks, instead of echoing what I put. So this way, someone looking over my shoulder couldn't see that my password is lobster chops or something. I actually really used to use that as a password, but not anymore. All right, so now you see what's missing here? So we type our password. Now what do we do? Right, we can't do anything because we haven't yet put the submit button. The submit button is what causes the action to take place, where all this information, in this case, is posted to the server. So I'm going to create another row, and I'm going to make the first field blank, and the second field, I'm going to put input, type equals submit, name equals, well, actually, I don't need to give that a name. I can just leave that like that. And as I add that, there's the submit button. Now, let's say I didn't like the fact that it says submit query on the button. Let's say I wanted it to say something else that would be a little less formal to the user. So what I can do is use the value attribute here, and let's call it the send info button, like that. So now the actual text on the button is changed. So I type and my password, I click send info, and it's sent for the server. All right, so now because it's a password, it asks if I want to remember that. I'm going to say no, never. All right, and it's submitted to our fictional server there. Now, one more thing. Some forms, especially longer ones, also have a reset button. I'm going to put that in here. Input type equals reset. And the reset button allows what's on the form to be erased so you can start the form over. So I'm going to spell input right, and there's our reset button. So now if I typed information into the form and I click reset, that information goes away so I can start the form anew. So again, it's always the input tag with what I've shown you so far. We just change the value of type. So we've looked at text type, which is last name and first name. We've looked at the password type, which echoes the dots, the reset, which creates the reset button, and the submit type, which allows you to submit the info to the server.